The Explainer, a Teton ghost story. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely captivating cultural mystery from the Teton Sioux, a branch of the Native American nation known as the Oseti-Sakowin, or the people of the Seven Council Fires. We're going to take a really close look at their ghost stories, and I promise you right now, these are not your typical campfire jump scares.
So, let's just get right into this. Imagine a member of your community, maybe a highly skilled hunter or a gatherer, goes out into the plains one day and just vanishes, completely disappears. No body is ever found. What happens to the people left behind? How do they even begin to cope with that kind of sudden, ambiguous loss? Well, as we'll see today, for the Teton communities, eerie ghost stories served an incredibly profound purpose. They weren't just meant to frighten people, they were actually a complex tool for deep cultural healing and ultimately a way to keep the idea of community alive.
Part 1. Beyond the Scaffold, Teton Burial Practices.
Before we can even talk about the ghosts, we really need to understand the physical reality of death for the Teton, or Lakota, who are the largest and most powerful of the 7 branches of the Sioux. How they physically handled the dead directly informed how they understood the afterlife. For the Teton, burial was almost invariably a scaffold type. First, a corpse was placed on a funeral bed supported by raised posts. Then, it was just left in the open air, fully exposed to the elements and time, to decompose. This was a very deliberate process designed to release the spirit that had animated the person in life, allowing it to move on to the realm of the dead. Now, occasionally, though not usually, the dead would be enclosed in a special lodge which they called a house burial. Keep that specific detail in mind because it is going to be incredibly important in just a minute.
Part 2. Dealing with the dead, the rules of engagement.
So, dealing with the dead came with some very strict rules of engagement. While some nations were just absolutely terrified of spirits, the Sioux didn't necessarily panic at the thought of them, but they were highly cautious because they believed ghosts were omniscient and potentially very dangerous if you disrespected them. Take these two completely contrasting encounters from a traditional tale called The Man Who Wrestled with a Ghost. In the first instance, a young warrior bumps into a female ghost and completely disrespects her by just pretending to be dead. Her reaction? She drops his foot 3 times and then literally pulls out a knife to cut it off as a trophy. But then, the very next night, he meets a male ghost. Even though he initially lies about having food, they eventually share a meal, they smoke a pipe in friendship, and then the ghost actually challenges him to a wrestling match. Because the warrior shows strength and engages respectfully, the ghost rewards him by predicting total success in his upcoming battle.
And the absolutely crucial point here is captured perfectly in that very story. It came out just as the ghost said. That is why people believe what ghosts say. For the Teton, the supernatural baseline is simply this. Ghosts know everything. If you interact with them, you are playing a high-stakes game with an all-knowing being.
Part 3. A Teton Ghost Story, The Hunter's Choice.
And that brings us to our main narrative, where a young man has to make a fascinating choice. The story kicks off with a young, successful Teton hunter who desperately wants to marry the most beautiful girl in the tribe, who happens to be the chief's daughter. Naturally, the chief demands a lot of horses for her hand, so this young brave sets out all alone to capture wild horses and win his bride. But while he's away, his tribe packs up the entire camp and moves on. Returning late in the day with his newly captured horses, the hunter finds his village completely deserted. Looking for some kind of shelter for the night, he spots this solitary lodge with sod covering its sides halfway up. He struggles to find the doorway in the dark, but finally manages to force his way inside.
Once inside, he realizes pretty quickly this isn't an ordinary tent. There are 4 high posts driven into the ground, supporting a burial bed, and on that bed lies a woman adorned in beautiful clothes ornamented with elk's teeth. He immediately recognizes her. She was a member of his tribe. But it hits him. She is now a ghost woman. He has accidentally stumbled straight into a house burial. But here's the crazy part. Instead of running away in sheer terror, he stays. In fact, they stay in that lodge for a long time, and she actually becomes his wife.
As you might expect, their domestic life is highly unusual. One day, the hunter is just thinking to himself that he'd really love to go on a buffalo hunt. He doesn't speak a single word out loud, but, like we talked about earlier, ghosts know everything. The ghost woman immediately responds to his thoughts, telling him, "You are hungry for buffalo meat? Mount your horse and ride back to the bluffs." She instructs him to rush right into the center of the herd, shoot the absolute fattest buffalo, and bring her a share of roasted meat before he even takes a bite himself.
and he does exactly as she asks. The ghost woman, who is decorated in these gorgeous rows of beadwork, tells him not to be afraid of her, but when he suggests that maybe they should just live like a normal married couple, she completely refuses. They have to pitch their tent during the day, and they can travel only by night. And as they travel, she walks ahead of him, her head covered and her legs completely invisible. She makes absolutely zero noise, just floating ghost-like through the darkness. And the kicker? The young hunter never returns to his people. Eventually, he too becomes a Teton ghost, floating alongside his ghost woman every single night, forever.
The story officially wraps up by firmly cementing that moral we learned earlier. Beware of ghosts, because ghosts know all things. The Tetons say ghosts know exactly when the winds will blow, when there's going to be snow, and when thunder and lightning will strike. They actually love the wind because it lets them float that much faster.
Part 4. Breaking Cultural Taboos, the Cost to the Community.
Now, on the surface, I know this might sound like a slightly spooky but ultimately romantic happily ever after for the hunter and his ghost bride. But is it really? Let's completely pivot here and look at this from a cultural perspective. When we really look closer, we see a massive number of cultural boundaries that were just completely crossed. First, the hunter entered a place of the dead, a literal tomb, without any authorization. Then, rather than keeping a respectful distance like he was supposed to, he embraced this super intimate relationship with a phantom. And most importantly of all, he deserted his living community just to follow his own personal desires.
You see, in traditional Native American cultures, including the Teton Sioux, the needs and the overall survival of the community almost always superseded the individual's wishes. Because of this specific hunter's choices, the village lost a highly skilled, really promising provider. The chief's daughter lost a prospective husband. By valuing his own personal, supernatural romance over his societal duties, it resulted in a tragic, permanent loss for the entire village.
Part 5. Ghosts and the Community. Finding closure.
So if this whole story really just represents a tragedy for the community, why even tell it? What is the underlying psychological purpose of this ghost story? Well, this is where we uncover exactly why Teton ghosts symbolize community in such a deeply poignant way. Ultimately, this story functioned as an incredibly powerful narrative of consolation. Think back to that very first question we asked. When a young man or woman went out hunting or gathering herbs and simply never came back, and no body was ever found, the survivors were left in this agonizing state of limbo. They had absolutely no closure.
But this folktale, it provided an answer. By listening to this story, a grieving family could imagine that their missing loved one hadn't died some brutal, terrifying death all alone out in the wilderness. Instead, they might have simply gone off with a ghost one loved and was still following that spirit and would always cherish and be cherished. Do you see what that does? It frames the loss of a community member not as an unsolved horror, but as a romantic eternity. It was a beautiful way to allow the community to process their intense grief, find a sense of closure, and heal together. It's just a brilliant coping mechanism, all wrapped up in a supernatural myth. Which leaves me with one final thought for you to ponder today. How does your own culture use stories to process grief and community loss? Are the movies, the books, and the modern myths we consume today really all that different from the Teton ghost stories shared out on the plains? Definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the stories around you.